I'm Hal Humphreys, and you're listening to The Sound of Pursuit, brought to you by Pursuit Magazine and PI Education. We're combining the weekly briefings with the Sound of Pursuit podcast. From now on, we'll just call it The Sound of Pursuit. This week, Bone Valley. Bone Valley is a podcast you can find wherever you listen to podcasts. If you don't subscribe to any podcast service, you can find Bone Valley over at lavaforgood.com/Bone Valley. You'll find the link in the description. I'm not a huge podcast listener myself, but at the insistence of a friend, I clicked my way over to Apple Podcast and opened Bone Valley. And after just a few minutes, I was sucked in. I could not stop. Here's what got me. First, the storytelling. Gilbert King and Kelsey Decker have crafted a narrative that is compelling and painstakingly researched. Second, the gut-wrenching realization that this is a perfect example of how the system, the criminal justice system, is not designed to interrogate its own results. A lot of times, once a prosecutor has settled on an account that serves the goal of conviction, the likelihood of changing that account is slim. In theory, our adversarial system relies on prosecution and defense coming to the table prepared for battle, both sides fighting, oftentimes in what amounts to legal and verbal pugilism. But once a conviction is obtained, it's agonizingly difficult to undo. I've seen it countless times as a private investigator. I can strongly recommend the podcast Bone Valley. The reporting is detailed, the storytelling is strong and moving. I had a chance to speak for a few minutes this week with Gilbert King, the reporter who created Bone Valley. I wanted to ask him his thoughts on the investigative process. Gilbert King, thank you so much for taking the time to do this. I know you're a crazy busy man right now. It seems like your podcast is getting a good bit of traction these days.
Yeah, it's really a pleasure to be here. And, those things are so unexpected, but, we always believed in the story. So we just grateful that people are listening. So thank you, Al.
One of the things that occurs to me and it just kind of hit me, I know that you went to college in Florida, but, we've got Beneath a Ruthless Sun, Devil in the Grove, now Bone Valley. What is it that keeps drawing you back to Florida?
There's a very funny scene that always reminds me of Florida. I don't know if you ever saw the movie The People versus Larry Flint. It's the story, Larry Flint's constantly in trouble, and he has this lawyer who's played by Ed Norton. And at one point, Ed Norton just decides to quit. Larry Flint is just too much trouble. And Larry Flint says to him, "Why would you quit? I'm rich and I'm always in trouble. I'm the perfect client." And that's how I think about Florida. It's like it's rich with these stories. They're always trouble. It's a third biggest populous state. And every time I'm down there, I get new stories coming to me. And this is no exception. It's just the people of Florida like to share.
I think realistically, we all have that one place that keeps drawing us back. For me, it's Texas. I do a lot of criminal defense work in Texas, and it seems like there's just always the next crazy thing going on. So I think that's probably how you feel about Florida.
It really is. The two states are sort of similar with that regard.
So we talked about Devil in the Grove just very briefly. Number one, what an amazing book. I'm on chapter 8 now. I cannot get enough of it. Where do people go to buy your books? Let's talk about that first.
Yeah, sure. I mean, they're available anywhere. Amazon, some bookstores. Devil in the Grove has been out like 10 years, but it's still in bookstores, I noticed. But probably the best place is Amazon, Barnes & Noble, online shops like that, just to make sure they're in, because especially Devil in the Grove has been out so long. So
Right. So Devil in the Grove, Ruthless Sun, did those in any way lead you in a roundabout way to this story?
Yeah, absolutely. And it's funny because I was doing a book talk back in 2018. I got invited by it's like a judicial conference for about 300 circuit judges in Florida. And afterwards, I did my talk about Devil in the Grove, and I think I was also doing Beneath the Ruthless Sun at the time, both of them. And afterwards, I was signing books, and this judge came up to me. We start the podcast out like this with this story because it's so interesting. He handed me a business card. This is a sitting judge. And I flipped it over and it said Leo Schofield, and it had his DOC number, and it said not just wrongfully convicted. He's an innocent man. And I remember I had dinner with some public defenders that night, and I showed them the business card, and they were passing it around. They were all kind of perplexed by it. They were like, a judge gave you this? A sitting judge gave you this? Talking about innocent. They're not supposed to do that, apparently, according to the judicial canons. And so it came around to one guy who was from Polk County, and he kind of looked at me seriously and he said, I know this case. You should call him. And that kind of tipped me off that there was something about this case that was worth looking into. And that was how it came to me. And after that, I started reading the transcripts, and I just became hooked on this case. And I figured, I knew that something was wrong, and I knew that this judge was really putting his reputation behind telling me that this guy was innocent. So that was like a really interesting tip-off. I don't get too many from judges like that.
Yeah, and that leads to the next question I had kind of lined up for you, is like, why this case and what stuck out when you started working on the story? And like, obviously, after doing the research and investigations and reporting, I mean, this is unfortunately a perfect example of, holy shit, they got the wrong guy.
Yeah.
Was it, I mean, I've gotten tips on things from people that I was like, well, I need to look into this. But at what point did you think, I really need to dig into this?
I think there was a moment where I was reading the transcripts and I was looking at police reports. I started filing some record requests. I went down and interviewed Leo Schofield in prison. I think the reason is like, as you and I know, there's a lot of wrongful convictions out there. They happen. This one was interesting because it didn't feel like a mistake, like they just made some mistakes. This felt like there was an intentional moment where they decided, like, we have to protect this conviction. And so when they start getting all this other evidence that points to a totally different suspect, their reaction is not what you would normally think. Like, let's investigate this and let's look into this. Let's make sure we got the right guy. It's like, let's close this and stop any further, investigation. So that was the moment where I thought something was awry. And I'd seen enough of it in Florida doing these investigations where I see, prosecutorial misconduct and perjury and manufactured evidence, that I knew that there was something wrong with this case. And that was really what really set me off.
Yeah. There's a story of a prosecutor down in Louisiana that had the old Sparky on his desk. You have the story of this prosecutor that had old Sparky on his tie clip. There's something inherently offensive about that, I think. And I think a lot of those old school prosecutors that had that mindset, it seems like, and we talked earlier about Pam Koloff and the writing she does, it seems like some of the older school prosecutors, once they got a case done, they were going to stick by it regardless.
Yeah, I mean, that's one of the most disturbing things that you learn when you start investigating these kind of cases is how much emphasis is placed on the finality. Like, you have to respect the jury's decision. This is judges have ruled on this, and as if they're infallible. And we also know that there's plenty of people who are actually convicted and later on exonerated and proven innocent and released from death row in Texas and in Florida, especially Florida. Florida gets it wrong. That and Texas are the two big states, I think, when it comes to these kind of wrongful convictions and exonerations. So yeah, it is kind of offensive, but I don't like to try to bring like this present day mentality to those kind of things. I think a more realistic way to look at it is in the more rural counties where they're really tough on crime, law and order, and state attorneys can run on that kind of campaign. That's not seen as a demerit or a bad thing that somebody's got an electric chair on their desk or on their tie clasp. That's seen as like, yeah, that's the guy we want, putting the bad guys behind bars. And so it's sort of a throwback to a different era, but also a throwback to like these more rural communities that are, that's not going to hurt you politically to have those kind of things.
Right. I'm curious, Pursuit Magazine is a magazine for private investigators. I'm a private investigator. And the thing that struck me about listening to this podcast is You and Kelsey did so much what I would call gumshoe work on this. You mentioned you started filing records requests. Ballpark for me, how much time did you spend doing just old school gumshoe work on this story?
I mean, I would really say years. I mean, we worked on this for 4 years, and because we had some setbacks, like we were going with certain directions, and that kind of fell apart on us. It just always meant we had more time. Another thing, like COVID was in the middle of this thing, so we kind of lost some of our travel capability and also access to some of the inmates that we wanted to interview because they were locked down. So, but I do believe those delays helped us in other areas, so we were able to actually go out and pound the pavement. I think one of the things that's really interesting is Bone Valley, because we didn't really, this started as like a feature story, an article that I was going to write. And after I started interviewing a few people and they were such great storytellers, I realized we should pivot to a podcast. It's so different for me because I'm used to dealing with things so far in the past. Everybody's dead. But we really got into the whole, like you say, gumshoe. And I think one of the things that happened with Bone Valley was that it almost became two podcasts as we were investigating. You had the Jeremy Scott side and then the Leo Scott. So we tried to weave it into this parallel narrative, doing the best we could. But Jeremy's side of the story was absolutely fascinating. We went back and talked to his family members. We were tracking down names of his friends because, these guys were all teenagers back in the 80s. So a lot of them are still alive. And, we found out they were willing to talk to us, and they would point to other friends like, oh, you're never going to find him because he had this nickname. We don't even know what his name is. It was a lot of that kind of stuff. And, you probably experience this all the time. Like I call it subpoena envy. There's certain people I just want to talk to so badly, and they just refuse to talk to you. But I do think that, like, coming into it from a journalism side or investigative side, there are also people that might not want to be willing to talk to detectives or they're reluctant about participating, but they do want to talk to outsiders. And so it kind of goes both ways. And I think we experience some of the good and some of the bad on both sides.
One of the things I've talked to with some of my journalist friends about is like the investigative journalists that I know and the good private investigators that I know, we do the same job. We just approach it for a different audience. For private investigators, our audience is first and foremost the attorneys we're working for, but then ultimately 12 people. For you guys, you're writing for a broader audience, but the job is the same.
I think so. I really love the whole idea of the work of a private investigator. I sort of fantasize. I see myself as that, like living vicariously through that, trying to poke around, but I think at the end of the day where it differs, it's the same work. I believe it's the same work, but you get to the end and I have to tell the story of all that. Whereas you're presenting for the case and evidence and that kind of thing. But up until the very end, I think it's the same kind of thing. And it's absolutely fascinating to me to just show up at a stranger's house and just sort of talk to them and build up some trust and get them to tell you things. And, I don't know. I just can see how addicting that is because sometimes I get so into it. I'm like, oh, damn, now I got to write this stuff. I feel like I already did what I was set out to accomplish. And now I got to write it.
Yeah, I tell people, as a private investigator, I don't have a badge, so I'm literally dealing with charm and good looks to get people to talk to me. And at best, I'm batting 500.
Well, at least you got the resources. I can't even show up with charm and good looks. I just make the best of it.
What resources do you use as an investigative journalist to find sources, to find what we would call witnesses in our trade?
I don't know if you notice this is difficult. I don't have as much experience about this as this, but people just don't have landlines anymore. Their cell phone records, and they're kind of difficult to reach. And I don't know about you, but like if I get a strange call, I very rarely pick it up, if I don't know who it is. So you end up leaving a lot of messages, and also people lose phones. So that we're just not really that sophisticated. One of the things that we learned was, and you probably noticed this too, is like going on Facebook and finding people. That's like been a kind of a resource. We were able to reach a lot of people through Facebook who, didn't have landlines, but would respond to a message on Facebook. So those are kind of the resources, just trying to be like really flexible and stay in the modern age of social media, because that has helped us.
That falls directly into the category of what private investigators like to call OSINT, open source intelligence, and it's a fantastic tool, and it's out there available to anybody.
Yeah, and I wish at one point we had access to like LexisNexis, and that helped us get more accurate stuff. But we just we lost that for a while. So a lot of times getting in touch with people was just reaching out to people that knew them and said, "Oh, I can get in touch with them for you," and doing a lot of that. But I think it's one of the most exciting parts of the job, but it's also kind of terrifying because there was a lot of times that we were reaching out to people who had been like serving time with Jeremy, or known him back from criminal days, and so they were not so happy to hear from a media person who wanted to talk to them. So we had some challenges along the way, and some people, like some of Jeremy's family, just didn't really want to speak to us. We reached out repeatedly, but we did end up tracking down his brother in a county jail in Alabama, and that proved to be really helpful to us. And he gave us some great information.
Well, I'm just impressed with the dogged nature with which you and Kelsey approach this story, and it occurs to me that like a lot of times during the process of an investigation, it feels overwhelming, and it's like you're trying to think of the next door to knock on or the next thing to do. At any point, did you think, I can't do this anymore, this is totally hopeless? Did you ever at any point think, I just want to quit?
Yeah, there was a couple moments where, you're just reaching out to people, and you can just see like their lives have been very difficult, and you're asking them to like share one of the worst moments of their lives. If they would mind telling us the story about this day where something really truly awful happened to them that's important to our story, and that feels a little bit tricky, because maybe in your case you might be just going back to lawyers with that, but we're going out there publicly, and this is going to be broadcast, and it's a difficult thing. And sometimes you'd be surprised, you stick a big microphone in someone's face, they forget about it pretty quick, and they start sharing some really intimate details, and you sort of want to say, we're here because this is going to be public, it's going to be out there. And that's always a thing that I'm always kind of surprised that people do participate in it. But I also think I respect people a lot for going back over these memories, because they understand why we're doing it.
Right.
And they believe that there might be an injustice that they can help with. And so that motivated a lot of people to help. So that was kind of surprising to me. But yeah, we did have a lot of moments where we were just, calling up people and getting, even death threats at times, like stay away from me or else, that kind of stuff. And, you just go, what am I doing here?
Yeah. One of the things, and I sent you ahead of time some things that I might want to talk about, and I'm really curious. An investigation like this, it costs money. You've got real expenses like airfare, hotel, cars, stuff like that. You've also got the incidentals, snacks and meals along the way, photocopies at the courthouse, that kind of business. As a private investigator, a lot of times we have a budget within which we have to work. How do you go about funding a project like this?
We always had the idea that we were going to be able to place this somewhere with a company that would want to buy it from us and go forward with that. So we had a couple setbacks early on. So we thought we were working, and we thought it was going to work out. And so I was funding it, knowing that, all right, I've done this before in my book. Sometimes you get an advance, but you'd only get part of that advance, and it's going to take more than that. So you just sort of getting behind things and knowing that, all right, the money will come later to pay for this. And so that's sort of the way I operated. Not really the most fiscally responsible way, but it was one of those things. It always seems to happen. I believe in this so much. I know it's going to work out. I know if I do this story right, someone's going to want to be interested in this. And so that's how I was operating, just knowing that I would get it to a place that would be able to, pay for it and be partners on this.
Wow. I'm impressed. Nice work. Most of the stories that you've done have been historical pieces. You've looked at things from way in the past. As you said earlier, most of the people are long dead. Is this the first time that you've ever actually witnessed how slowly the wheels of justice grind?
Yeah, I would say yes, because I experienced it in real time. And one of the things, like, with Devil in the Grove, that story, the crime happened in 1949, well, the alleged crime, right? So that's 73 years ago. Everybody was dead for the most part. There were a few survivors that I was able to talk to, but not too many. That just took decades and decades for the injustice to correct itself. This one feels different because it feels more urgent because there's an innocent man in prison. And, one of the things that really disturbed me is like when those fingerprints were finally identified in 2004, belonging to Jeremy Scott, it wasn't for another 5.5 years that got into court because the prosecution just slowed it down with their investigation. And that was the thing that just really disturbed me. Like that would be something I think you'd recognize that this could mean that we have an innocent man in prison. Let's put a priority on this. And instead they did the opposite. They just dragged it and slowed it down. And I believe this is all about protecting that conviction, the finality. We don't want to reinvestigate this because it opens up a whole can of worms. And, when somebody's life is on the line, somebody who's wrongfully incarcerated or possibly, I think like the state owes it in a situation like this is obviously new evidence to be as thorough and as possible and as quickly as possible, because every day that an innocent man spends in prison is one day too many. And I just saw the opposite. The wheels just ground to a halt almost.
I was talking to Christopher Scott, an exoneree out in Texas a couple of years ago, and he described it as once the system gets its claws into you, it does not want to let go.
Yeah, and I can just feel that just, going through Leo Schofield's case and just seeing how, everything just sort of grinds to a halt. Everything is fought tooth and nail. And the state has a tremendous advantage over this because when they go to an appellate court, a lot of times the judges are former prosecutors who worked with these same prosecutors. They come from that culture. And, depending on what kind of county or parish you're in, some of these more rural ones, they're not interested in conviction integrity review units. They're not interested in going back over cases that they might have gotten wrong. Those are black marks. They'd rather those things just die in silence.
Yeah. The appeals process, as you've learned firsthand, is mind-numbingly tedious. And you get judges looking at the record, and at a certain point, you've got, a number of denials for new trial, a number of lost appeals, and it feels like there's nothing left to do. Tell our listeners what they can do today to have an impact on Leo Schofield's life.
Right. Right now, the only thing that it has been done so far in this early process is that the Innocence Project of Florida has put together a petition on change.org. And you can sign that petition. And basically what they're calling for is for the state attorney in the 10th Circuit, because they do not have a conviction integrity review unit, to turn it over to any conviction integrity review unit in the state. I think there's 4 or 5 of them, and have them look at it independently. I think it's asking a lot. I'm not even sure that the state attorney would agree to something like that, but we just felt like that's a good start, and we supported the Innocence Project in this idea to start it that way. I think there's going to be more things coming up in the future that they are talking about, and they're still considering it. They're talking to Leo about it. So I think there will be some more steps, but the first thing right now is that petition on change.org.
And we will post a link to that in the description for the podcast and the YouTube channel so that everybody knows where to go to sign that petition. I think it's incredibly important that people do that. And again, you're not asking for the state to let him go today. You're just asking them to give it a fair hearing.
Yeah, I think there's been just sort of this, buckling down within this local circuit. And it hasn't really gotten out of that yet. And so even when it gets to the appellate court, it's still very local. And I think it's just like, give it a fresh set of eyes. I've talked to so many people about this case, and the ones who really know it a lot are pretty clear where this case stands and that it should be reviewed, and that there's all this evidence that, the state just says, well, the appellate deadline is passed on that. That can't even be considered anymore. Whereas, these conviction review units, they can come in and say, there's no deadlines. We're looking at the whole case. This is a legitimate claim of innocence. We're going to start from scratch. And I think any conviction integrity review unit that looks at this case and looks at the evidence that we've put together, I'd be happy to share everything I have, would come to the same conclusions that we have, like the wrong person is in prison. And Hal, I'll give you an example. I'd love to get your thoughts on this. I often talk about this hypothetical. In the case of Leo Schofield, these fingerprints were discovered, and the ones that they belong to, Jeremy Scott, who's in prison for another murder, basically said, "Oh, I probably stole something out of the car," and he denied killing Michelle. And then a few years later, he reversed himself and said, they kind of promised me they would help with me with my parole. It was my freedom, but that never happened. They lied to me. I'll tell you exactly what happened. And he told the whole story about what happened that night. He's forensically connected to the crime scene, and he's confessed. And now the state is basically saying, well, you can't believe him because he initially denied it. Now he's saying he did it. He's not credible, blah, blah, blah. If this was just reversed, this is my hypothetical. If it was reversed and you had a prisoner say, hey, I killed this woman named Michelle Schofield back in 1987, the first thing the state would say, that's great. Anyone can say that. Where's the forensic proof that links you to the crime scene? Well, in this case, there is. So if it was just a matter of bad luck for Leo Schofield, that the way things turned out. But the fact is, the man who's confessed to the crime multiple times is forensically connected to this crime scene. It really doesn't get any more specific than that.
Yeah, and the problem is, number one, I'm not an attorney, so I don't fully understand. I'm so jealous of my law school friends that are attorneys today because they understand the entire process a lot better than I do. I'm as a private investigator, I'm kind of in my lane and I try to stay there because it's what I'm good at. But I have worked on enough of these cases, post-conviction cases, where there is new evidence found, but then you have to go through the process of proving that it's new evidence and that you didn't have access to it at the time. And this goes back to ineffective assistance of counsel. If you've got an IAC claim, then that evidence might be considered new, but the whole thing just kind of, it's like the snake eating its own tail. It just keeps on circular logic. And meanwhile, an innocent person is still locked up and there's no real resolution to it.
No, it's just awful. And you look at the mistakes that this attorney made. Like, those fingerprints were right there. They were turned over. This isn't a Brady situation. They were right there. He just didn't look at the evidence. He didn't look at the police reports. He didn't read, he just didn't do a lot of pretrial preparation. He was kind of winging it. That was his style. And it was just a really bad style in a case like this, a circumstantial case. Like, they really need someone who was on top of it. And he made so many mistakes. And then, when they try to go for the ineffective assistance of counsel, everybody goes, Jack Edmond, he's the most famous lawyer in town. He's got his name on a billboard. He's a great lawyer. He can't be ineffective. Everybody loves Jack. But, even Jack admitted that he didn't understand the rules of evidence.
Yeah, and the problem with that I've seen this a number of times. The attorney who represented the person says, I was ineffective in my assistance of counsel. And then the state paints it as, well, you're just falling on your sword to get the best result for your client. It really is a frustrating process. At the end of the day, this work, as you've experienced and as any criminal defense investigator has experienced at all, it's difficult and it can be very disappointing and disheartening, but it does have rewards. You've been buried in this story for years now. You've got, I'm going to assume, somewhat of a personal interest in the outcome, the ultimate outcome of this story. Is there anything that you've gained personally from getting involved in this story and doing this work?
Wow, that's a really good question. And, I think one of the things is when you meet a truly innocent person who's been convicted and spent 35 years in prison, the fact that they've survived this and they have not lost their entire soul, they've not become extraordinarily bitter, means that they've gone through a process that you and I will never go through. Like, a lot of times you think, if that happened to me, what would keep me going? To find out somebody else is saying they did the crime and the state is still buckling down and not believe, like, how do you lose all hope in humanity? So when you meet someone who is, wrongfully incarcerated and who hasn't lost that spirit and is they're almost like Gandhi in a way. It's really hard to describe it, but they've reached a peace with themselves and with their life that you and I never really experience unless we've really gone into prison for 35 years and still maintained our, sanity. So I think that's the thing I've really gained is this look on life from Leo Schofield himself, and just sort of recognizing what he's had to do, the strength he's had to muster in order to survive this. It's just being around someone that special and talking to them. I've gained a lot of appreciation for that, and I'm very grateful for him coming into my life in this way. Very surprised me.
That's amazing. I love that. Gilbert, I thank you so much for taking the time to talk with us today. Again, I know you're busy. For our listeners, where can they find the podcast to listen to it?
Sure. Bone Valley, you can listen to anywhere you listen to podcasts, whether it's Apple, Spotify, you name it, it's there. You can also go to lavaforgood.com, and that's the website, and just, you can just Google Bone Valley and you'll find it. But it's free. It's out there. All 9 episodes are out there. They're free. So it's out there.
I love it. Do me a favor. Tell Kelsey Decker that I missed talking to her today, and amazing work from her as well. I mean, you can tell in the podcast that she's there doing the work of the Lord right by your side.
She really is. She's incredible, and I love to see the arc of this really shy, nervous person just starting out to at the very end, confronting the state attorney, and then sitting in the room with Jeremy and asking some of the best questions of that time there. And so, yeah, well, she'll definitely appreciate it. And hopefully next time we can get her on.
That sounds great, Gilbert. Thank you again.
My pleasure, Hal. Thank you so much. Love talking to you.
Gilbert King, do me a favor. Find the podcast Bone Valley and listen to it. It's an amazing story. You won't be disappointed. You can find us over on Twitter at Pursuit Mag. If you want to find me personally, you can find me at FindPI. Do not forget to subscribe to our YouTube channel. The link will be right below the video. Subscribe now at PI Education on YouTube. I'm Hal Humphreys, and that is The Sound of Pursuit. And now a quick word from our sponsors.